What are your thoughts on relatively high correlation between changes in the size of the central bank's balance sheet and the price of the S&P 500? Well, definitely a correlation there. Although I don't know how that correlation is held up after 2020. I shouldn't. No, it's definitely held up after 2020. I should have said I don't know how that correlation has held up after 2021 when they announced the rate hike. Actually, it's probably still holding up there. Yeah, now that I think about it. But I don't know that there's anything to it. I think it's just, I don't know that there's a causal thing there, other than from a psychological standpoint. I think when they're doing QE, just the market participants, that's kind of a signal to them that the Fed has your back and the Fed wants you to buy. Therefore, you don't fight the Fed type thing. But the argument that from a mechanical standpoint, that actually creates currency units that would not exist otherwise to go in and buy risk assets, I don't buy that at all. And and if the argument is that, well, it lowers rates and therefore, those entities prefer to buy stocks because they can only get 1% on a 10-year. Not really, because if you look at QE, often there's an inverse relationship. So meaning that if the Fed is dropping rates or doing QE, excuse me, so the Fed's balance sheet is going up, a lot of times interest rates will actually go up. So I shouldn't have said inverse. I should have said counterintuitive. Excuse me. So a counterintuitive relationship. So you would think that if they are doing QE, that's more demand for treasuries, the price would go up, the yields would go down. But if you look at a chart of QE and look at like the 10-year, you see that often the opposite is true. When the Fed comes in, buys treasuries, does QE, the price actually goes down often, therefore yield up. And so it gets tricky there. And also this to believe that there's a causal relationship there outside of psychology, you would have to believe that the bank's balance sheets were somehow constrained. And you would also have to believe that a bank reserve somehow has purchasing power that a treasury doesn't. And that doesn't make any sense to me, right? Because most people just, okay, so what you're doing is it's an asset swap, really. It's just you're swapping a treasury for bank reserves or cash. All right. Well, 90% of I shouldn't say 90, but a majority of the entities that own those treasuries or that would be selling them, the bank reserves and treasuries are indistinguishable as far as what they can do on their balance sheet. You can just take those, let's think about that for a moment. Imagine if there's a hedge fund that says, oh my gosh, we have $1 billion. And I mean, we really, really would love to buy stocks right now. But unfortunately, we can't because we have all these stupid treasuries on our balance sheet. So what we're going to have to do is we're just going to have to sit back and wait until the Fed comes in and buys these treasuries from us. Then we'll have the money to go buy all the stocks that we wish we could buy right now. You see, when I say it like that, it sounds ridiculous because you just ask yourself, okay, if you want to buy the stocks, why don't you just sell the treasuries? Exactly. Or if you want to keep the treasuries, why don't you just use them as collateral to borrow the money and then buy the stocks? And then you say, oh, George, well, you're looking at the amount of currency or the amount of purchasing power, the bank's balance sheet capacity and aggregate total. You see that there's not going to be that liquidity to lend for that hedge fund to borrow to buy those shares in the first place, or maybe there's not enough liquidity to sell the treasuries or something like that. And it's just nonsense because that's assuming that the only entity that provides liquidity is the Fed. No, what are we talking about here? No, the major provider of liquidity is the commercial banking system. We all know that. There's no constraint on liquidity. The banks create money. Period. End of story. So now you could argue that there's an environment where the banks aren't willing to create that money. Okay, but that doesn't mean their balance sheet is really constrained. That's a completely different topic of conversation. See, so when you look at it that way, I just don't know how. Now, if you say, okay, that hedge fund, that $1 billion hedge fund that we were talking about, now they have treasuries, and then oh, wait, the Fed's doing QE. Aha. So then the hedge fund manager comes in and says, look, the Fed wants us to buy. I'm not going to fight the Fed. The Fed's got my back. The Fed wants asset prices to go up. And if the Fed wants asset prices to go up, most likely they're going to go up. So I'm going to sell all these treasuries and I'm going to go buy risk assets. All right. But that's QE creating an environment that gives a tailwind to risk assets as a result of psychology, not necessarily because there's more liquidity in the system or anything that happens on a mechanical side or within the plumbing of the financial system. And that's why I think there's a correlation.